Every morning before the sun clears the tree line in southern Thailand, millions of hands reach for the same thing. Not coffee, not breakfast, not a phone. A cup of dark green liquid thick as brewed bark, bitter enough to make a first-timer gag. It has no brand name on the side of the cup. It costs almost nothing. In many villages it costs exactly nothing, because the tree it comes from grows at the edge of the property. The same tree that grew there when their grandfather was alive, and his grandfather before him. The people drinking it are rubber tappers, fishermen, construction workers, rice farmers. They drink it in the dark, standing up, before walking into work that will destroy their bodies by the time they are 50. They don't think of it as a drug. The word doesn't apply, the same way the word doesn't apply to the coffee a lawyer drinks before court, or the cigarette a nurse smokes between shifts. It is simply what the morning requires. There are an estimated 15 million people doing this in Southeast Asia every single day. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. In some villages in Surat Thani province, the deep south of Thailand, plantation country, where the air smells of rubber sap and wet soil before dawn, surveys have found that over 70% of adult men use this plant daily, not occasionally, not recreationally on weekends, every single day before work, without which the work does not happen. The plant is called Kratom. And right now, depending on where in the world this story is being watched, it is either completely legal, a controlled substance, a Schedule 1 equivalent of heroin, a gas station supplement, a folk medicine, or a criminal offence carrying 5 years in prison, simultaneously, on the same planet, in the same week. That is not an exaggeration. That is the actual legal status of Kratom in 2024, fragmented across countries, states and counties so unevenly that a person can buy it at a convenience store in Georgia, drive to Indiana, and face a misdemeanor for having the same product in their bag. A veteran in Arizona uses it to manage pain from a spine injury he got in Fallujah, and considers it the only thing that allowed him to stop taking oxycodone. A teenager in Kelantan, Malaysia, mixes it with cough syrup and mosquito coil fluid in a concoction that has put hundreds of people in emergency rooms. A retired Thai government pharmacologist has spent 30 years trying to get it banned, then 10 more years trying to undo that work. They're all talking about the same plant. The numbers make less sense the closer you look. In the United States alone, somewhere between 10 and 15 million people use Kratom regularly, as of the mid-2020s, a number larger than the population of Switzerland, using a substance that has never received FDA approval, that has no standardized dose, no regulated supply chain, and no agreed-upon scientific classification. Is it an opioid? Technically no. Does it act on opioid receptors? Yes. Can it cause dependence? Yes. Can it kill you on its own? Almost never. The question of what Kratom actually is, chemically, medically, legally, morally, has been fought over for decades by scientists, governments, pharmaceutical companies, veterans groups, and addiction researchers, and the fight is not over. This is not a story about a substance spiralling out of control in a back alley. There are no clandestine labs, no cartel supply routes, no synthesized chemicals cooked up by someone trying to get around a law. The Kratom tree, Mitragina speciosa, grows wild across Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia and Myanmar. It has always grown there. It grew there before any of the countries that now regulate it existed. People have been using its leaves for documented, recorded, unambiguous purposes for at least 200 years, and almost certainly longer than that. Which raises the question that this story exists to chase. How does something that old, that common, that embedded in the labour culture of an entire region become one of the most legally contested plants on Earth? How does it travel from the jungle to the gas station shelf? How does it end up simultaneously saving people from opioid addiction in Ohio and landing rubber tappers in Thai prisons under laws that, as it turns out, were never written for the reasons anyone believed? The answer starts not with a drug, but with a tree, and not with a crisis, but with a cup. But first, the 1943 Thai Kratom Act, the world's first national prohibition of this plant, was not passed because kratom was hurting anyone. The government had a different reason entirely, and it would take 60 years for anyone to say it out loud. The kratom tree does not look dangerous. That is the first thing. It grows to 20, sometimes 30 meters tall, with broad leaves the size of an open hand, dark green and waxy on top, pale underneath, with a central vein that runs clean and straight from stem to tip. It thrives in the humid lowland forests of the Malay Peninsula, in the kind of heat that makes everything slow down by midday, where the soil is red-brown and the air never fully dries. It is a member of the coffee family, not a distant cousin, the same family, Rubiaceae, that produces the bean in every cup of coffee on Earth. That detail alone tells something about what kratom does at low doses, and why the people who first used it reached for it the way everyone else reaches for caffeine. The tree has been part of the landscape of southern Thailand, northern Malaysia, and coastal Indonesia for longer than any written record can confirm. The earliest reliable documentation comes from 1839, when a Dutch colonial botanist named Peter Willem Korthals encountered it while cataloguing the plant life of the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia. He gave it its scientific name, Mitragina speciosa. The word Mitragina came from the shape of the leaf stigmas, which reminded him of a bishop's mitre. He noted its existence, classified it, moved on. He had no reason to think it was anything more than a tree. The people living around it had known for generations that it was not just a tree. Indigenous communities across the Malay Peninsula had developed precise, practical uses for the leaves, rooted not in ritual or recreation, but in the economics of physical labour. Farmers chewed the fresh leaves before long days in the paddy fields. Fishermen used them on overnight boats to stay alert through the cold hours before dawn. The preparation was simple. Strip the leaf from the stem, remove the central vein, which contains less of the active compound. Fold the leaf, and chew slowly, the way a person chews gum, releasing the juice gradually into the bloodstream through the mucous membranes of the mouth. The onset was fast, 20 minutes, sometimes less. What happened in those 20 minutes would take Western science another 100 years to begin explaining. The kratom leaf contains over 40 identified alkaloids, chemical compounds that interact with the human nervous system. 2 of them do most of the work. Mitragynine is the primary compound, making up roughly 66% of the alkaloid content in a typical leaf. The second, 7-hydroxymitragynine, is present in far smaller quantities but is dramatically more potent, estimated to be 13 times stronger than morphine by weight at the receptor level. Both compounds bind to the mu-opioid receptor in the brain, the same receptor that morphine, heroin and oxycodone bind to. But they do not bind to it in the same way, and that difference is the entire argument, the scientific, legal and human argument that runs through this entire story. A full opioid agonist, like heroin, locks onto that receptor and activates it completely. Mitragynine is a partial agonist. It activates the receptor partially, producing a ceiling effect, meaning that taking more does not proportionally increase the effect the way it does with heroin. That ceiling is one of the reasons kratom-only overdose deaths are extraordinarily rare, a fact that would become critically important in a debate that hadn't started yet. At low doses, 1 to 5 grams of dried leaf, The stimulant effects dominate. Energy increases, fatigue decreases, focus sharpens. At high doses, above 10 grams, the opioid receptor effects take over. Pain relief, sedation, a sense of calm that can feel, to someone in chronic pain, like the first deep breath they've taken in months. For a rubber tapper working a 14-hour day with a blade in the pre-dawn dark, the low-dose effect was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. This is the world Somchai Wiroj was born into in 1971, in a village 20 kilometers outside the city of Surat Thani, in the rubber plantation belt of southern Thailand. His father tapped rubber. His grandfather tapped rubber. The work began at 2 a.m, when the latex ran best in the cool air, and it did not end until well past noon. A rubber tapper walks kilometers of trees in the dark, making a precise angled cut in each trunk. Too shallow, and the latex doesn't flow. Too deep, and the tree is damaged. Collecting the white sap in small cups, then returning to gather it all before the heat thickens it. The hands must be steady. The pace must be relentless. The body must function whether it wants to or not. Somchai was 16 years old in 1987 when his uncle handed him a bundle of fresh kratom leaves before a shift that started at 2:15 in the morning. There was no ceremony around it. His uncle didn't explain what the leaves would do. Explanation wasn't necessary in a place where the leaves were as normal as a meal before work. Somchai stripped the veins, folded the leaves, and chewed, walking toward the first row of trees in the dark with his uncle ahead of him. He would describe it later, not in any official record, but to a researcher who visited the village in 2003, as feeling like the fatigue simply stepped aside. Not euphoria, not a high. The tiredness that had been sitting on his shoulders at 2 a.m. was replaced by something steadier, a kind of functional alertness, the body willing to do what was being asked of it. He worked the full shift. His cuts were clean. He didn't think about what he had taken. He thought about the trees. That was 1987. By then, kratom had already been illegal in Thailand for 44 years. Somchai knew this the way he knew other distant administrative facts. Technically, officially, and completely irrelevant to any morning he had ever lived. His father had been arrested once, fined an amount roughly equivalent to 4 days' wages, and continued using kratom the following morning without interruption. The law existed in Bangkok. The leaves existed in Surat Thani. The two had almost nothing to do with each other. Almost. Because somewhere in Bangkok that same year, a young government pharmacologist named Dr. Naren Kasetsiri was being assigned his first major research project. He was 28 years old, recently graduated, and newly employed by the Thai office of the Narcotics Control Board. His assignment was to produce an up-to-date scientific assessment of kratom use in the southern provinces, its prevalence, its pharmacology, its social impact. He packed a bag, took a train south, and began asking questions in villages where the answers had been obvious for 200 years. What he found in those villages was not what the assignment had prepared him to find. The users were not the profile of a drug problem. They were not young, not criminal, not destitute, not chaotic. They were middle-aged men with calloused hands and precise daily schedules who used a plant to do physically punishing work and then went home to their families. The kratom was not destabilizing anything. It was, in some observable way, holding things together. Dr. Naren wrote exactly that in his preliminary report. He sent it to Bangkok. It sat on a desk for 8 months. When a response finally came, it did not engage with his findings. It asked him to focus his next report on the potential for abuse and addiction. He understood then that the question he'd been sent to answer was not actually the question anyone was asking. What he did not yet understand was why. The kratom tree does not need to be cultivated. That was always the problem for some people. It grows without irrigation, without fertilizer, without any agricultural intervention whatsoever. A mature tree produces leaves continuously across the growing season, and in the tropical climate of the Malay Peninsula, the growing season is essentially the entire year. A family living near a stand of kratom trees had access to an unlimited supply of pain relief, endurance enhancement, and mild euphoria at zero cost forever. No middleman, no market, no transaction of any kind. This is not an unusual feature of a plant. What made it unusual was the context it existed in. By the early 20th century, the British colonial administration controlled the opium trade across Malaya, present-day Malaysia and Singapore, with the same deliberate precision it applied to rubber and tin. Opium dens were licensed, regulated, and taxed. The revenue was substantial. In 1905, opium taxes accounted for more than half of the Straits Settlement's total government income. Half. The colonial economy of the region was not merely tolerant of opium addiction, it was structurally dependent on it. The Siamese government, which controlled Thailand, ran a parallel system. The opium franchise, the exclusive right to import, process and sell opium, was auctioned to the highest bidder every 3 years, generating revenues that funded roads, military salaries, and the administrative apparatus of the Thai state. Opium was not a social problem in the eyes of the government. It was a fiscal instrument. And then there was kratom, free, everywhere, used by the same population of the labourers that the opium market depended on as customers. A 1932 internal survey by Thai government officials in 4 southern provinces, Surat Thani, Nakhon Si Thammarat, Pattani, and Songkhla, produced a finding that was uncomfortable enough to be circulated only within the relevant ministry. In all 4 provinces, kratom use was more widespread than opium use. The survey noted explicitly that many labourers who had previously used opium had switched to kratom, citing cost, or rather, the complete absence of cost, as the reason. The document used careful, neutral language, but the implication was not neutral at all. Every labourer who switched from opium to kratom was a lost revenue stream, not a recovered addict, a lost customer. That survey was filed in 1932. The Thai Kratom Act, making kratom possession a criminal offence, was passed in 1943. The connection between those 2 dates would not be publicly discussed for another 6 decades. In the years between that survey and that law, kratom continued spreading. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the slow, inevitable logic of something that works. It moved along the same routes as labour migration, north into central Thailand with workers following construction projects, east into Cambodia with seasonal agricultural workers, south through the Malay Peninsula, carried by the same rubber tappers and fishermen who had always used it. It did not move as a drug. It moved as a tool, passed from person to person the way a useful piece of equipment gets passed. Here, try this, it helps. In Malaysia, under British colonial administration, kratom was noted in botanical surveys but generated no official concern. The British were managing an opium economy and a rubber economy simultaneously, and a leaf that helped plantation workers stay productive was, from a colonial productivity standpoint, not obviously problematic. Several British plantation managers in the Perak and Kelantan regions were documented in administrative logs of the 1920s and 1930s as quietly tolerating kratom use among their workers, not because of any enlightened view of labour welfare, but because the output numbers held. What kratom was doing, functionally, was solving a problem that no one in an official position wanted to acknowledge existed. The problem of extracting maximum physical labour from human beings in conditions that the human body was not designed to sustain. The rubber tapper's body at 45 looked, in clinical terms, like the body of someone much older. Joint deterioration from repetitive motion, chronic back pain from hours of bending, hands that had absorbed latex chemicals until the skin cracked and bled in the dry season. There were no workplace injury programs, no ergonomic assessments, no regulated rest periods. There was the tree, the blade, the cup, and the quota. Kratom did not fix any of that, but it made the body willing to continue day after day through pain that would otherwise have forced a stop. By the time Somchai Wiroj's father was born in 1948, Kratom was so normalized in the plantation belt of southern Thailand that its illegality, the law had passed 5 years earlier, was treated as a bureaucratic abstraction by virtually everyone who lived there. The law was enforced sporadically, usually by police officers who wanted something and found the possession charge useful as leverage. An actual committed enforcement campaign against Kratom in rural southern Thailand in the 1950s would have meant arresting the majority of the adult male workforce. Nobody did that. Somchai's father learned to use Kratom from his own father. He taught Somchai. The law appeared nowhere in that transmission of knowledge. In 1989, 2 years after Somchai's uncle handed him his first bundle of leaves, Dr. Naren Kasetsiri returned to Bangkok from his third research trip to the southern provinces and sat down to write the report he had been asked to reframe. The Office of the Narcotics Control Board wanted documentation of Kratom's abuse potential. Dr. Naren had spent 8 months in the south. He had interviewed over 200 users, spoken with village health workers, reviewed the available pharmacological literature, which was sparse, largely colonial-era botanical work, and almost entirely inconclusive on the question of addiction. What he had found was this: physical dependence was real. Regular users who stopped abruptly experienced sweating, muscle aches, insomnia, irritability, a withdrawal syndrome that was genuinely unpleasant but not medically dangerous. No one he interviewed had been hospitalized for Kratom withdrawal. No one had died. The dependence profile looked, in the literature, closer to caffeine than to heroin, not in terms of the receptor mechanism, which was different, but in terms of real-world severity of withdrawal and functional impact on daily life. He wrote that, all of it, carefully, with citations. Then he wrote a second section, because something else had caught his attention during those months in the south. Something nobody had asked him to look for. In Surat Thani and Nakhon Si Thammarat, he had encountered a different preparation of Kratom that was not the traditional chewing method. Young men, not plantation workers, not the labour demographic that had always used Kratom, but teenagers and men in their early 20s, with no particular occupational reason to need an endurance aid, were brewing the leaves into a concentrated tea and drinking it in large quantities. Larger than the traditional dose, much larger, and they were mixing it. The combination varied by location. In some areas it was Kratom tea with cough syrup containing codeine, a mixture that stacked 2 opioid receptor activating substances and produced an effect considerably stronger than either alone. In other areas, users had begun experimenting with other additives. The combinations were improvised, informal, and completely uncharted in any pharmacological literature. Dr. Naren flagged this in his report as a separate phenomenon requiring urgent further study. He drew a clear distinction between traditional labour use, low dose, functional, centuries old, and this emerging recreational pattern, which was younger, higher dose, and chemically more complex and unpredictable. He submitted the report. He waited. 3 months later, the response came. His supervisors noted his findings. They thanked him for the thorough work. They told him that for the purposes of policy, the distinction he had drawn between traditional use and the emerging mixed-use pattern was not applicable, because Kratom was already illegal under the 1943 Act, and the enforcement question was simply one of resources and priority. Dr. Narin read that response twice. Then he put it in a drawer. He had just been told in careful bureaucratic language that the nuance he had spent 8 months developing was inconvenient, that the institution's existing position made his findings structurally unnecessary. What nobody told him, what he would not discover for another 14 years, was that the thing he had noticed in those villages, the mixed-use pattern among young men, the kratom and cough syrup combination that he had flagged as requiring urgent study, was already spreading. Quietly, steadily, invisibly to any authority that might have intervened. By the time anyone looked directly at it, it would not be a research footnote. It would be a public health emergency across an international border. The preparation takes 11 minutes. Exactly that, if done correctly. Fresh leaves, the larger ones, from the middle branches where the alkaloid concentration peaks, are stripped of their central veins with a thumbnail, folded once lengthwise, and either chewed directly or boiled into a tea. Somchai Wiroj, by the time he was 25, had been doing this for 9 years, and had developed preferences as specific as any craftsman's. He preferred the leaves harvested in the early morning before the heat climbed, because the afternoon leaves tasted sharper, more astringent, and hit differently, faster, less even. He used a clay pot his uncle had left him. He boiled the leaves for exactly 11 minutes, strained the liquid through a cloth worn thin from years of the same use, and drank it standing up, looking out toward the first row of rubber trees. The cup held roughly 4 grams of active material. That is a low to moderate dose by any clinical measure. Within 20 minutes, the mitragynine in his bloodstream had crossed into his central nervous system and begun doing several things at once. At the adrenergic receptors, the same system activated by adrenaline, it produced increased alertness and reduced perception of fatigue. At the myopioid receptors, at this dose, the activation was partial and mild, enough to take the edge off the chronic ache in his left knee, which had been swelling every rainy season since a fall from a truck bed in 1991. His hands steadied. The specific quality of pre-dawn exhaustion, that particular heaviness behind the eyes, lifted without being replaced by anything jittery or artificial. He simply felt ready. That was the word he used with the researcher in 2003. Ready. There is a precision to the traditional kratom dose that gets lost in almost every Western account of the plant. The plantation workers who had used it for generations were not seeking intoxication. Intoxication was counterproductive. A rubber tapper who was impaired could not make the precise angled cuts the tree required. A fisherman who was sedated on a boat at 3 a.m. was a fisherman who didn't come home. The traditional dose was calibrated by a century of practical feedback to land in exactly the stimulant range. Alert, functional, pain-reduced, not high. That calibration lived in the hands of the people using it. It was not written down anywhere. Somchai, by 1996, was one of the most productive tappers in his section of the plantation. His quota was consistently met by 9 a.m. His supervisor, who didn't use kratom himself but was not naive about who among his workers did, had never once raised the subject. The output was what mattered. Somchai's wife, Ratchani, noticed something her husband didn't. On the mornings he ran out of leaves, which happened perhaps twice a year, during the brief period between one batch drying and the next being harvested. He was different in a way that was hard to name but impossible to miss. His jaw was tight. He answered questions with shorter sentences than usual. By mid-morning his left knee was visibly bothering him in a way it never did on ordinary days. He moved around it rather than through it, slightly off his normal gait. The work still got done. But the quality of his presence at the dinner table that evening was different, thinner somehow, as if a layer of insulation had been removed. He didn't mention it himself. He may not have noticed it as a pattern distinct from ordinary bad days. Or he noticed, and didn't consider it significant enough to discuss. Either way, the observation lived entirely with Ratchaney. This is what physical dependence looks like at low to moderate doses in a functional user before anyone has framed it as a problem. Not dramatic, not catastrophic. A tightening, a gait adjustment. Dinner quieter than usual. The pharmacology underneath that quiet scene was operating precisely as expected. The mu-opioid receptor, stimulated daily, had begun to downregulate. The brain's standard response to repeated activation of any receptor system, essentially reducing its own sensitivity to avoid constant overstimulation. This meant Somchai's baseline, without Kratom, was now measurably below where it had been at 16. His natural pain tolerance, his natural energy production, his natural mood floor, all had shifted downward to compensate for the daily chemical input. The Kratom was not destroying these systems, it was simply making them redundant, and the body had responded by scaling them back. This process has a clinical name, neuroadaptation. It is not unique to Kratom, it is not unique to opioids. It happens with caffeine, with alcohol, with benzodiazepines, with SSRIs. The body adapts to whatever it receives consistently. What varies between substances is how severe the adaptation becomes, how quickly, and what withdrawal from that adapted state feels like. With Kratom, at traditional doses, the adaptation was real but bounded. The ceiling effect of mitragynine as a partial agonist meant that the neuroadaptation had a limit, unlike with full opioid agonists, where the dose required to achieve the same effect can spiral upward indefinitely. Most traditional users in Somchai's village had been using roughly the same amount for decades, not escalating, not chasing a stronger hit, just maintaining. Maintaining was the operative word, and it was a word that carried different weight depending on who was using it. For Somchai, it meant being able to work, to provide, to function inside a life that required physical endurance most people in air-conditioned offices cannot conceptualize. For a pharmacologist looking at his receptor profile, the word maintaining described a state of physiological dependency that required a daily chemical input to sustain baseline function. Both of those statements were simultaneously and completely true. By 1996, Somchai's daily routine had incorporated a second cup of Kratom tea at midday, not because the morning dose had stopped working, but because the afternoon shift required a different kind of endurance than the morning. The morning was about alertness and precision. The afternoon, when the heat reached its peak and the body's energy reserves were genuinely depleted, required more of the pain relief effect and less of the stimulant. He had calibrated this himself over years, with no guidance from any medical professional, because no medical professional in his province was discussing Kratom in clinical terms. The knowledge was entirely empirical, lived and adjusted. He was 25 years old and had already accumulated 9 years of daily use. By any pharmacological standard, he was dependent. He would have agreed with that word readily, with no particular distress attached to it, the same way a person who cannot function before their morning coffee would agree with the word dependent, without considering it a crisis. The difference, and this is the distinction that will run like a fault line through everything that comes later, was that nobody was trying to ban coffee. In Bangkok that same year, Dr. Naren Kasetsiri was 35 years old and had just been promoted to a senior research position within the office of the Narcotics Control Board. His earlier reports on Kratom had been noted, filed, and not acted upon. He had moved to other projects, methamphetamine, which was devastating northern Thailand in the mid-1990s in ways that generated the kind of visible, acute crisis that commanded institutional attention. Yaba, methamphetamine tablets mixed with caffeine, was everywhere. Young men were psychotic, violent, hospitalized. That was a crisis that looked like a crisis. Kratom looked like nothing. Because Kratom, in its traditional form, produced no visible acute crisis. The dependence was quiet, functional, and woven so completely into the fabric of daily labour life in the South that it was essentially invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Dr. Narin was not looking at it. He had other fires. But in his desk drawer, the report from 1989 was still there. The section he had flagged, the young men, the mixed preparations, the kratom and cough syrup combinations appearing in Surat Thani, had not generated any follow-up research, any enforcement action, or any further inquiry. It had generated nothing. In 1996, the same year Somchai added his midday cup, a secondary school in Kelantan, Malaysia, across the border, 40 kilometers south of the Thai province of Narathiwat, recorded 17 students absent on the same Monday morning. A teacher who visited their homes found them in various states of extreme sedation. Their families didn't know what they had taken. The school reported it to local health authorities. Local health authorities passed it upward. The substance in their systems turned out to be kratom tea, mixed with a popular over-the-counter cough syrup consumed in quantities far beyond anything traditional use involved. The health authority report described it as an isolated incident, recommended monitoring, filed it, moved on. The 17 students recovered. 15 of them were back in school by Wednesday. 2 of them would still be using the same mixture 5 years later, at doses that had climbed steadily in the way traditional plantation worker doses never had. The distinction between those two trajectories, the plateau of the plantation worker and the escalation of the Kelantan teenagers, was the most important thing nobody was studying. The plant was the same, the pattern was completely different, and the reason for that difference was not the plant, it was the mixture, and what the mixture was doing to the ceiling. The Thai Kratom Act of 1943 was passed on August 3rd during the middle of a war. That timing matters more than almost anything else about the law. Thailand in 1943 was under Japanese military occupation, nominally an ally of Japan, practically a country whose government was trying to preserve whatever administrative sovereignty it could, while Japanese soldiers occupied its railway stations and its ports. Bangkok was not in a position to project power confidently outward. The normal machinery of public debate, parliamentary scrutiny and policy consultation was functioning at reduced capacity under the pressure of a wartime occupation that nobody in the Thai government had genuinely wanted. Legislation passed in that environment did not require the same evidentiary standard it would have required in peacetime. Laws could move faster, justifications could be thinner. The official stated reason for the 1943 Kratom Act was public health and social order. The text of the law described kratom as a harmful intoxicant, producing dependence and social dysfunction. It classified kratom possession as a criminal offence. It made growing, selling, importing and consuming the plant illegal. The penalty for possession was up to 1 year in prison, for sale up to 4 years. No public health data accompanied the law. No documented epidemic of kratom-related hospitalizations preceded it. No surge in kratom-related crime statistics had been recorded in any provincial police report. The law appeared without the evidence that normally, in any functional public health system, would have generated the law. What had been recorded in internal government documents that would not surface publicly until researchers began filing archival access requests in the early 2000s was the opium revenue problem. A 1941 internal memo from the Thai Revenue Department noted with measurable concern that opium tax receipts in 4 southern provinces had declined over the preceding 3 years. The memo identified the cause directly: widespread substitution of kratom for opium among the labouring population. Kratom was free. Opium cost money. People were making a rational economic choice, and that choice was costing the government revenue it depended on. The memo recommended action. 2 years later, the Kratom Act passed. This is the first major fault line running underneath the entire history of Kratom regulation, not just in Thailand, but in every country that followed Thailand's lead in classifying the plant. The original prohibition was not a public health measure. It was a fiscal one. The leaf was not banned because it was hurting people. It was banned because it was competing with a government revenue stream, providing the same population with the same effect at zero cost. The opium trade that Kratom was undercutting was itself producing catastrophic addiction across the same population. Opium dens in southern Thailand in the 1930s were generating precisely the kind of social devastation, family breakdown, debt, physical deterioration that the Kratom Act claimed, without evidence, that Kratom was producing. That irony was not noted in any official document of the era. Somchai's father, Prasert Wiroj, was 23 years old in 1971, the year Somchai was born, and had been using Kratom since he was 15. He knew the law existed. Every adult in his village knew. The knowledge coexisted comfortably with complete non-compliance, the way populations everywhere absorb the existence of laws they consider unconnected to their own reality. In 1978, that changed. A police officer from Surat Thani city came to the village as part of what the provincial police department described as a routine enforcement sweep. He found dried kratom leaves in the shed behind Prasert's house, approximately 2 kilograms, which was roughly a 2-week personal supply. He charged Prasert under the 1943 Act. Prasert was taken to the district police station, held for 2 days, fined the equivalent of 4 days' wages, and released. The fine was paid. Prasert walked home. The next morning he went to the tree at the edge of the property and cut fresh leaves. The enforcement had not changed the calculation at all. The fine was smaller than the cost of 2 weeks of opium would have been, and he was not using opium. The law had extracted money and produced nothing. Somchai was 7 years old when his father came home from those 2 days at the police station. He remembered it later as an event without particular drama. His father returned. His mother was visibly relieved. The household resumed. No one sat him down and explained what had happened. The kratom tree at the edge of the property continued to be the kratom tree at the edge of the property. 23 years later, Somchai would stand at a police station himself. But that comes later. In Bangkok, the institutional machinery around Kratom was operating on a separate timeline entirely. Dr. Naren Kaset Siri, through the 1990s, had moved deeper into methamphetamine research and further from Kratom as an active concern. The Aba crisis was consuming the attention of every narcotics researcher in Thailand. By 1998, methamphetamine-related arrests had surpassed all other drug offences combined. Kratom arrests, by contrast, were scattered, mostly rural, mostly minor fine level, generating no statistical alarm. But Dr. Naren had not entirely let go of the 1989 report in his drawer. In 2003, he submitted a funding application to conduct a formal follow-up study on kratom use patterns in southern Thailand, specifically a structured comparison between traditional labour use and the mixed preparation patterns he had flagged 14 years earlier. The application was specific about what had changed: the emergence of a preparation called 4x100, which had spread significantly since the late 1990s. The name came from the formula: 4 fingers of kratom tea, 100 millilitres of a cough syrup containing either codeine or dextromethorphan, sometimes a crushed anxiolytic pill, sometimes, in the version that had begun appearing in southern Thai villages and across the border in Malaysian states, a piece of boiled mosquito coil, an insecticide product, dissolved into the mixture. The pharmacological logic of adding mosquito coil to a kratom drink does not immediately present itself. The active compound in the most commonly used mosquito coils in the region was a pyrethroid insecticide. Its presence in the mixture was not generating a documented pharmacological effect, so much as functioning as a signifier, a marker of the extreme end of the use spectrum, a way the mixture announced its own intensity to the people drinking it. People were boiling insecticide and drinking it. That sentence requires a moment of stillness before the next fact lands. Not because they didn't know it was an insecticide, because the sedation they were seeking required, at the doses they had reached through months of escalation, something beyond what the kratom and codeine combination alone was delivering. The ceiling that mitragynine partial agonism created had been circumvented, not by using more kratom, but by stacking other substances on top of it to activate the opioid receptor more completely. The traditional user's plateau had been engineered around. The ceiling was gone. Dr. Narin's 2003 funding application was reviewed, reduced in scope, and approved with a budget sufficient to conduct interviews in 2 provinces, rather than the 6 he had requested. He accepted the reduction and began the work. In Surat Thani that same year, a researcher visited Somchai's village to conduct interviews on traditional kratom use, a separate study, unconnected to Dr. Narin's work, conducted by a public health graduate student from Chiang Mai University. Somchai was 32. He'd been using kratom daily for 16 years. He answered the researcher's questions plainly, with the specificity of someone describing a professional practice rather than a personal secret. He mentioned the clay pot, the 11-minute boil, the preference for morning harvested leaves. He mentioned the midday cup he had added 6 years earlier. The researcher asked if he had ever tried other preparations. He said he had tried the 4 times 100 mixture once, in 1999, when a younger cousin had offered it. He had found it excessive, too much sedation, too fast, too heavy to work through. He had gone back to the tea the next morning and hadn't returned to the mixture. The researcher noted this. What the researcher also noted, in a section of the interview transcript that did not make it into the published paper, was that Somchai's village had changed since the late 1990s. The 4x100 was present. Not dominant, the traditional users were still the majority, but present and younger. The people using the concentrated mixture were in their teens and 20s. They were not rubber tappers mostly. They were young men with fewer working hours, more unstructured time, and a desire for the mixture's primary output, which was not productivity. It was oblivion. The distinction Somchai made instinctively, too much to work through, was the same distinction that separated the traditional use pattern from the emerging crisis. Work was the regulating mechanism. The need to function set the dose. Remove the work, remove the function requirement, and the ceiling becomes a challenge to overcome rather than a feature to maintain. Dr. Narin's reduced study confirmed what he had suspected. The 4 times 100 pattern was significantly more prevalent than the 1989 data had suggested. It was concentrated in the 15 to 25 age group. It was present in every province he was able to visit. And it was producing, in users who had been on the mixture for more than a year, a physical dependence profile that looked nothing like Somchai's. Tremors, significant weight loss, withdrawal symptoms severe enough to prevent functioning without the next dose. He completed the study. He wrote the report. He sent it to the Office of the Narcotics Control Board with a recommendation. Immediate targeted intervention focused specifically on the 4 times 100 preparation, with a formal distinction drawn in policy between the mixture and traditional kratom use. The response came 6 weeks later. The office noted his findings. It recommended increased enforcement of the existing 1943 Kratom Act across all forms of kratom use. No distinction, no differentiation. The leaf and the insecticide cocktail were the same crime. Dr. Narin read the response and understood something that his earlier reports had not yet made clear to him. The institution was not confused about the distinction between traditional use and the 4x100 pattern. It was uninterested in the distinction. A distinction would have required a nuanced policy response. The existing law was blunt and simple and already on the books. Enforcing it required no new thinking. He placed the response in the drawer with everything else. Across the border in Malaysia, the 4x100 mixture, called by different names in different states, most commonly air Kratom camper, or simply the drink, was spreading through secondary schools and village youth populations in Kelantan and Terengganu with a speed that the 1996 Kelantan school incident had not predicted. Malaysian health authorities had received Dr. Narin's research through academic channels. They had received similar findings from their own researchers. The warnings existed. All of them, documented, dated, formally submitted. And none of them had produced a single prevention program, a single targeted intervention, a single public health campaign. By 2004, the mixture was in every state in peninsular Malaysia. By 2005, Malaysian hospital emergency departments were beginning to see a pattern in their intake data. Young male patients, sedated, often in respiratory depression, with a combination of substances in their bloodstream that no single drug policy had anticipated. The crisis that Dr. Narin had flagged in 1989, formally documented in 2003 and recommended targeted action on in the same year, was arriving precisely on the schedule that anyone reading his reports could have predicted. Nobody had read them, or rather, somebody had, and decided the timing wasn't right. The question of who made that decision and why pointed somewhere that the researchers had not yet thought to look. The Malaysian emergency rooms did not all sound the alarm at once. That is how these things work. A pattern in intake data does not announce itself. It accumulates silently across separate hospitals, separate provinces, separate patient files that no single doctor is reading simultaneously. The young man brought in unconscious in Kota Baru, and the young man brought in unconscious in Kuala Terengganu were, statistically, unconnected events until someone with access to both datasets looked at them side by side. That someone was Dr. Fauzia Chela, a public health researcher at University Sains Malaysia, who in 2004 began compiling emergency department records from 6 hospitals across Kelantan and Terengganu, specifically because she had read, in an academic journal with a circulation of approximately 300 researchers, Dr. Narin's 2003 study. She had recognized the pattern he described. She had seen it herself, informally, visiting relatives in Kelantan, where the drink had become unremarkable in certain neighbourhoods the way cigarettes become unremarkable. What her dataset revealed when assembled was not a spike. It was a slope, gradual, consistent, and going in one direction. Emergency admissions involving the Kratom mixture had increased every single year since 2000. Not doubled overnight, not exploded in a news cycle, just climbed steadily, the way a slope climbs, patient by patient, ward by ward, year by year. She submitted a formal research report to the Malaysian Ministry of Health in late 2004. The report contained the admission data, a pharmacological analysis of the mixture's compounded effects, and a specific public health recommendation, a targeted educational campaign in secondary schools, combined with restrictions on bulk cough syrup sales in the affected states. The cost estimate for implementing both recommendations was included in the report. It was modest. The intervention was specific. The evidence was documented. The Ministry of Health acknowledged receipt. Then nothing happened. For 5 years, nothing happened. By 2006, the mixture had a new variant. In parts of Kelantan, users had stopped boiling mosquito coils and switched to a different additive. cough syrup containing dextromethorphan, a dissociative compound that, at high doses, produces effects resembling ketamine. The pharmacology of this version was dramatically more unpredictable than the codeine variant. Dextromethorphan at high doses can cause psychosis, seizures, and respiratory failure, effects that Kratom alone essentially never produces. The ceiling was not just gone now, the floor had dropped. Hospitalizations began converting into fatalities, not in large numbers. The absolute death toll remained in statistical terms relatively small. But the deaths were young, a 17-year-old in Pasir Mas, an 18-year-old in Bashok, a 19-year-old found unresponsive in a rubber plantation, and the specific geography of that last detail, the rubber plantation, the same landscape where the plant had functioned as a labour tool for 2 centuries, carried an irony that nobody in any official document paused to note. The Malaysian government's response when it finally came in 2009 was total and blunt. Kratom was reclassified under the Poisons Act as a Schedule 1 substance, the most restrictive classification available, the same category as heroin and cocaine. Possession for personal use carried a maximum 2-year sentence. Trafficking carried the death penalty. The death penalty! For a plant that grew wild along every riverbank in the country. The cough syrup that provided the codeine that transformed the mixture from a low-grade dependency into a respiratory emergency, that remained on pharmacy shelves, purchasable over the counter, subject only to a new purchase quantity limit that was, in practice, almost never enforced. This asymmetry, the plant criminalized to the maximum extent of the law, the pharmaceutical component left largely untouched, would become a template that repeated itself in different forms across different countries in the years that followed. In Thailand, Somchai Wiroj was 35 in 2006 and had been using Kratom for 19 years. He was not using the mixture. He was using the same clay pot, the same 11-minute boil, the same 2 cups daily. What had changed was the supply chain around him. The 4x100 pattern in his province meant that younger users were now harvesting Kratom leaves more aggressively from the communal trees along the village edge, not for traditional use, but for the concentrated tea that fed the mixture. Several of the trees that had been accessible and productive for decades were being stripped faster than they could regenerate. Somchai had, without planning to, become a supplier, maintaining his own trees more carefully than the public ones, drying surplus leaves, providing them to older workers in the village whose access to fresh leaves had become inconsistent. He didn't think of this as dealing. Neither did anyone in the village. He was sharing a resource, the way a person with a productive vegetable garden shares with neighbours who don't have garden space. The leaves changed hands without money. It was a completely informal economy of mutual support. Under the 1943 Thai Kratom Act, it was also distribution of a controlled substance. Somchai knew this in the abstract. He proceeded anyway, for the same reason his father had proceeded after the 1978 fine. The law's logic did not connect to the reality he was living inside. 7,000 kilometers away, that reality was becoming someone else's opportunity. The American Kratom market did not begin with a business plan. It began with the internet. In the early 2000s, Kratom appeared on online ethnobotanical forums, websites where people with interests in unusual plants traded information, experience reports, and sourcing tips. The users were a specific subculture, curious, research-oriented, largely young and educated, interested in altered states as a subject of personal inquiry. The initial discussion of Kratom on these forums treated it as a pharmacological curiosity. Here is a Southeast Asian plant. Here is what it does. Here is how to obtain dried leaf powder from import suppliers in Indonesia and Malaysia. The first American Kratom vendors were not pharmaceutical companies. They were individual entrepreneurs buying powder in bulk from Southeast Asian exporters and reselling it through PayPal and rudimentary websites with names that suggested herbalism rather than narcotics. The product was legal. Nobody in the American regulatory system had thought to schedule it, because nobody in the American regulatory system had heard of it. By 2010, that had begun to change. The American opioid epidemic, which had been building since the late 1990s through the mass prescription of OxyContin and related drugs, and which would eventually kill over 500,000 Americans, had by 2010 produced a secondary phenomenon. Millions of people physically dependent on prescription opioids who were simultaneously desperate to stop. Opioid withdrawal is genuinely brutal. The sweating, the muscle cramps, the insomnia, the anxiety. They last for days and they are physically overwhelming. Many people who genuinely wanted to stop could not get through the withdrawal without relapsing. Some of them found Kratom. The mechanism made pharmacological sense. Kratom's partial agonism at the mu-opioid receptor was sufficient to blunt opioid withdrawal symptoms without delivering the full opioid effect. It was, in functional terms, a self-administered taper, using a weaker opioid-adjacent substance to step down from a stronger one. Veterans forums, chronic pain communities, and opioid recovery groups began sharing this information with the velocity that the internet allows when people discover something that actually helps them. By 2012, the FDA had noticed. An import alert, essentially a directive to block Kratom shipments at the border, was issued that year, then expanded in 2014. The FDA's stated concern was unapproved drug claims being made by vendors. The legal mechanism required showing that Kratom was being marketed as a medicine, which many vendors were indeed doing carelessly. The import alert slowed but did not stop the market. Domestic cultivation and processing operations emerged. Vendors reformulated their marketing language. The product stayed legal at the federal level because it had not been formally scheduled, and scheduling required a process that the DEA had not yet initiated. In 2014, two things happened simultaneously that accelerated everything. The American Kratom Association was founded, a consumer advocacy group established explicitly to resist scheduling efforts and push for a regulatory framework that would allow Kratom to exist legally as a botanical supplement. Its founding members included vendors, users, and researchers who believed that proper regulation, rather than prohibition, was the appropriate response to a substance with genuine therapeutic utility. The same year, a paper published in the International Journal of Drug Policy compiled the first systematic review of Kratom-related fatalities in medical literature. The number was small, fewer than 10 cases globally, where Kratom was listed as a primary cause of death. But the paper noted something significant. In virtually every case, the deceased had multiple substances in their system: benzodiazepines, opioids, alcohol. The Kratom had not acted alone. The word associated in the FDA's eventual figure of 36 Kratom-related deaths was doing exactly this work. Associated meant present in the toxicology report. It did not mean causative. It did not mean that Kratom, without the other substances, would have produced the same outcome. That distinction between presence and causation became the central contested ground of the entire American Kratom debate, because the FDA's public communications did not consistently maintain that distinction. Scott Gottlieb, appointed FDA Commissioner in 2017, gave a series of public statements describing Kratom as an opioid with a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. He cited the 36 deaths. He did not, in those public statements, consistently note the polydrug context. The framing was clean and alarming and technically misleading in a way that was difficult to challenge in a press conference but straightforward to challenge in a pharmacology journal. The journals challenged it. The press conferences continued. Meanwhile, the market kept growing. By 2016, the kratom industry in the United States was generating an estimated $1 billion annually. Gas stations in Georgia sold it in single-dose packets next to the energy drinks. Specialty kratom bars had opened in Florida. Online vendors shipped it to 43 states. The product existed in a regulatory gap so wide that a person could drive from a state where it was perfectly legal to a county where it had been locally banned and not cross any visible border marker. That regulatory chaos was about to be interrupted by the most aggressive federal action against kratom in American history. On August 30th, 2016, the DEA published a notice in the Federal Register. It announced its intention to temporarily place kratom's two primary alkaloids, mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, into Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. Schedule 1, the same classification as heroin, the same classification that has, in the entire history of the DEA, been reversed for a substance exactly 0 times once permanently applied. The notice gave 30 days for public comment. In the history of the DEA's Emergency Scheduling Authority, no substance had ever generated significant public resistance to this process. The mechanism was designed to move fast, to bypass the slower formal rule-making procedure, to act on substances posing imminent hazard. It had always worked quietly. This time would be different. But on August 30th, 2016, nobody knew that yet. In Thailand, Somchai Wiroj did not know that the DEA existed. He was 45 years old, and his left knee had worsened enough that by this point, his midday cup had become less about sustained energy and more about being able to walk the afternoon rows without stopping. He had begun drying larger quantities of leaves than he needed personally, because 3 other workers in his section had begun buying from him. Small amounts, paid in kind rather than cash, the informal economy of the village operating exactly as it always had. He had no idea that in 30 days, a decision made in Washington would determine whether the thing he had done every morning for 29 years was, in American legal terms, equivalent to manufacturing heroin. He poured his morning tea, looked at the tree line, and went to work. The DEA's August 2016 notice did something unintended. It created a paper trail. When the agency published its intent to schedule kratom's alkaloids as Schedule 1 substances, it was required by law to provide a scientific and medical evaluation justifying the decision. That document, dense, technical, and not written for general audiences, was appended to the Federal Register notice and became, for the first time, a publicly available official summary of the United States government's position on kratom's pharmacology, abuse potential, and medical value. Researchers read it over the Labor Day weekend. What they found in that document was not fabrication. The science cited was real. But the framing was selective in ways that became immediately apparent to anyone working in opioid pharmacology. The evaluation emphasized kratom's action on opioid receptors, while consistently omitting the partial agonism distinction that determined its safety ceiling. It cited abuse reports without noting that many came from the 4x100 mixture context rather than standalone kratom use. It referenced the associated deaths without specifying polydrug involvement in the majority of cases. Dr. Jack Henningfield, a Johns Hopkins pharmacologist who had spent his career studying drug dependence and had consulted for the FDA on multiple substance evaluations, read the document and reached a specific conclusion. The evaluation did not meet the evidentiary standard that the DA's own guidelines required for emergency scheduling. He began drafting a formal scientific response. He was not alone. Within 2 weeks of the notice, 8 independent researchers had published open letters, preliminary analyses, and formal objections through academic channels. The objections were not pro-drug advocacy, they were methodological. The science in the scheduling document had gaps that a peer-reviewed journal would have required addressing before publication. None of this on its own would have stopped the DEA scientific objections to emergency scheduling had been raised before. They had never reversed the process. What happened next had never happened before. The Kratom user community, veterans with spinal injuries, recovering opioid addicts, chronic pain patients, and people who simply used Kratom the way Somchai used it and had no interest in being classified as heroin users, mobilized with a speed and organizational coherence that the DEA had not anticipated from a population using a botanical supplement. The American Kratom Association had, since 2014, been building an email list and a legislative contact database. The moment the scheduling notice appeared, that infrastructure activated. Within 72 hours of the Federal Register publication, users were contacting their congressional representatives directly, not through form letters, but through personal accounts of what Kratom had replaced in their lives. A veteran from North Carolina described, in a letter to his senator, the 14 medications he'd been on before finding Kratom. A woman in Ohio described using it to get off the oxycodone she'd been prescribed after a car accident and had been unable to stop taking for 3 years. The 30-day public comment period generated over 140,000 individual submissions. To understand what that number means, the previous record for public comments on a DEA drug scheduling action was approximately 2,000. The Kratom response was 70 times larger. The DEA's comment system had not been built to process that volume. The agency's staff received letters, emails, and calls from constituents that cascaded into congressional offices, which in turn generated something more structurally significant than public opinion. 8 United States senators, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, signed a joint letter to the DEA demanding that the agency withdraw the emergency scheduling notice and conduct a full formal rulemaking process instead, with proper scientific review and public input. The letter cited specific procedural concerns about the emergency mechanism being used for a substance that did not meet the statutory definition of imminent hazard. On October 12, 2016, 43 days after the original notice, the DEA withdrew it. This had never happened. In the entire history of the agency's emergency scheduling authority, a notice had never been withdrawn in response to public pressure. The DEA cited the need for further review. The statement was careful and did not acknowledge that the withdrawal was extraordinary, but it was. The Kratom community declared victory. Researchers called it a necessary correction. The DEA said nothing further, and somewhere in that moment of apparent resolution, something else was happening that almost nobody was watching. The patent office had been busy. In 2015, a year before the DEA notice, a research group with pharmaceutical industry affiliations filed a United States patent application for a series of synthetic compounds derived from mitragynine, specifically chemically modified versions of Kratom's primary alkaloid designed to retain its analgesic properties while reducing its side effect profile. The application was not secret. Patents are public documents, but patent applications are dense, technical, and filed without press releases. The patent, U.S. Patent 9,790,229, was granted in October 2017, 13 months after the DEA withdrew its emergency notice. The assignee was a research entity with documented financial relationships with major pharmaceutical interests. The patent covered synthetic derivatives, not the natural plant compound itself. But the implications of that distinction were significant in a specific direction. The natural compound could not be patented because it existed in nature. The synthetic version could be patented because it was a human-made modification. This meant that kratom in its natural form, the leaf, the powder, the tea, was a competitor, an unpatentable, unownable, naturally occurring competitor to a proprietary synthetic that pharmaceutical interests had just secured the exclusive rights to develop. The next question asked itself, organizations lobbying against kratom legalization in various states had, through the standard mechanisms of American political finance, received funding from sources traceable through campaign finance disclosures. The disclosures were public. They required cross-referencing. A journalist named Patricia Callahan at the Chicago Tribune did that cross-referencing in 2018 and published her findings. Several organizations advocating for kratom's Schedule 1 classification had received financial support from entities with direct or indirect connections to pharmaceutical companies with interests in the synthetic alkaloid space. The amount of money was not enormous. The connections required several steps to trace. No single document showed a pharmaceutical executive writing a check specifically to ban kratom so their patent could flourish. The architecture was distributed, the way these arrangements always are, across multiple organizations, multiple funding streams, multiple layers of institutional distance. But the structure existed, and it rhymed, with uncomfortable precision, with something that had happened 73 years earlier in a different country, in a different language, for the same underlying reason. In 1943, the Thai government banned a free plant because it was competing with a revenue-generating substance the government controlled. In 2015 and 2016, private interests in the United States were filing patents on synthetic versions of that same plant's compounds, while simultaneously supporting efforts to ban the natural version that competed with those compounds. The mechanism was different. The logic was identical. Dr. Naren Kassett-Seary, now 60 years old and working on the book he'd been writing since his retirement from the office of the Narcotics Control Board in 2015, encountered the Chicago Tribune piece through an academic news aggregator. He read it twice. He had spent 30 years working within a Thai regulatory system built on a law he'd come to understand was itself a product of economic interest masquerading as public health. He was now reading that the same structural logic had reproduced itself independently, in a different country, in a different regulatory system, around the same plant. He opened a new document on his laptop and began adding a chapter he had not planned to include. The chapter argued something that neither the pro-kratom nor the anti-kratom side in the American debate had fully articulated, that the history of kratom regulation, in every country where it had occurred, followed a consistent pattern. The pattern was not primarily driven by evidence of harm. It was driven by the economic inconvenience of a substance that worked, was free, could not be owned, and therefore threatened whatever system stood to profit from its users' pain. He was not the first person to observe this. He was possibly the first person who had been inside the institution long enough to document it from both sides. He submitted the chapter to his publisher in March 2019. That same month, in Surat Thani, Somchai Wiroj was standing in a room at the provincial police station for the second time in his life. He was 47 years old. He had been using kratom for 31 years. He had been arrested not for personal possession, but for the dried leaves found in his shed, the surplus he had been providing to the 3 other workers in his section, the arrangement that had functioned as a neighborhood supply system for years without incident. The charge was distribution of a narcotic substance. The potential sentence was 5 years. His hands, sitting in that room, were steady. They were always steady in the morning. But Racheni, waiting outside with the bail amount written on a piece of paper she had borrowed the money for from her sister, had not slept. The bail amount was 40,000 baht. Rachani had borrowed 25,000 from her sister and spent 3 hours on the phone arranging the rest from 2 other relatives before the police station closed for the evening processing window. She arrived with the full amount in an envelope that had been handled by 4 different people that day. The officer at the desk counted it twice. Somchai walked out at 6:45 in the evening, 19 hours after he'd been brought in. He did not speak on the drive home, not from trauma, from calculation. He was working through the mathematics of his situation with the same practical focus he brought to the Morning Rose. The charge was distribution. The evidence was the dried leaves in the shed. The 3 workers he supplied had already been interviewed separately. He did not know yet what they had said. The legal process would take 14 months. During those 14 months, Somchai continued going to work every morning. He continued drinking his tea. He stopped keeping surplus leaves in the shed. He now kept them distributed across 3 locations on the property, smaller quantities in each place, a precaution that required more management but reduced the evidentiary profile of any single find. He did not stop providing leaves to the 3 workers. He simply changed the logistics. The informal economy of the village did not pause for his legal situation. Rachaney watched all of this without comment. In Washington, the FDA had not accepted the DEA's 2016 withdrawal as the end of the Kratom question. It had accelerated its own independent action. Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, in February 2018, published a lengthy public statement on Kratom that was unlike any previous FDA communication on a botanical substance. It did not merely flag safety concerns. It made a categorical claim. Kratom had opioid properties, met the criteria for substances with high abuse potential, and had no accepted medical use in the United States. The statement was framed as scientific consensus. It cited a computational model, a software analysis of Kratom's alkaloids, as evidence of opioid-like activity. Independent pharmacologists responded within days. The computational model, they noted, predicted opioid activity based on molecular shape alone, without accounting for the partial agonism that determined actual clinical effect. Using the same model, one researcher pointed out, would classify several common blood pressure medications as having opioid properties because molecular geometry and receptor activity are not the same thing. The FDA did not update its statement. The scientific community was now split not along ideological lines, but along methodological ones. A dispute about what kind of evidence counted, what the appropriate comparison substance was, and who had the authority to resolve the classification question. That dispute was generating papers, conference presentations, and formal letters to regulatory agencies. It was generating almost no actionable policy. Into that vacuum, state legislatures began moving independently. Alabama banned Kratom in 2016, Arkansas in 2016, Indiana in 2014, Wisconsin in 2014, Vermont in 2016. Each ban was enacted without formal scientific hearings specific to Kratom. Most were passed by adding Kratom's alkaloids to existing controlled substance analog lists, a mechanism designed for synthetic drugs manufactured in clandestine laboratories, now being applied to a tree that had been growing in Southeast Asian forest for millennia. The bans produced a specific, documentable consequence that nobody in the legislatures appeared to have modelled in advance. In states where Kratom was banned, the opioid recovery communities that had been using it as a taper tool lost access to it abruptly. Some members of those communities reported returning to prescription opioids or street drugs. These reports were anecdotal, collected by advocacy organizations, and therefore dismissible as interested testimony. But they were consistent across multiple states and multiple organizations, and they pointed to an outcome that the public health framework had not accounted for, that removing Kratom from a population already dependent on it without providing an alternative produced its own crisis. The opioid epidemic that Kratom had been quietly absorbing some portion of was still killing people at a rate that made every other drug crisis in American history look modest. In 2017, opioid overdose killed over 47,000 Americans. That number included heroin, fentanyl, and prescription opioids. It did not include Kratom as a standalone cause of death in any statistically significant way. Both of those facts existed simultaneously. The FDA cited one consistently. Researchers cited both. In Thailand, Somchai's case moved through the provincial court system with the specific slowness of minor drug charges in a system overwhelmed by major ones. His lawyer, a young man from Surat Thani city, who had taken the case for a reduced fee because his own father had been a Kratom user, argued that the quantity found did not support a distribution charge and that the absence of any financial transaction in the informal supply arrangement was materially relevant to intent. The court reduced the charge from distribution to possession with intent. The distinction mattered enormously to the potential sentence. It mattered less to the legal record which would carry the conviction regardless. Somchai was fined 15,000 baht and given a suspended sentence of 18 months. He would serve no prison time provided he committed no further offences within 3 years. He paid the fine in 2 instalments. The second instalment took most of what remained in the household savings account. He was 48 years old. He had a suspended sentence and a fine and a legal record for possessing a plant his grandfather had grown on the same property. He went home. He drank his morning tea the next day. He went to work. And then, from a direction nobody in Somchai's village was watching, everything began to shift. The Thai parliament had been reviewing its narcotics legislation since 2019, not specifically because of Kratom, but because the broader framework was outdated, enforcement was inconsistent, and the prison system was significantly overburdened with low-level drug possession cases that were consuming resources without producing rehabilitation outcomes. A parliamentary subcommittee on narcotics law reform had been convened, and Kratom had appeared on its agenda in a context that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. The economic argument had arrived. Indonesia, the world's largest Kratom producer, the plant grew abundantly across Borneo and Sumatra without any cultivation, had developed a significant export industry by 2018. Indonesian Kratom powder was the primary supply source for the American market, shipped legally from Indonesian ports to American importers, generating foreign exchange revenue that Indonesian agricultural economists had begun tracking with interest. Estimates placed Indonesian Kratom exports at between 4,000 and 13,000 tons annually by 2019, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for smallholder farmers who had previously relied on palm oil prices they couldn't control. Thailand's southern provinces had the same growing conditions, the same trees, the same centuries of agricultural knowledge, and a law that made touching those trees a criminal offence. The subcommittee received testimony from agricultural economists, from public health researchers, from law enforcement officials who described Kratom enforcement as consuming disproportionate police resources in southern provinces where violent crime required more urgent attention. Dr. Naren Kasetsiri, now fully retired and having published his book 6 months earlier, submitted written testimony that drew on the archival research he'd conducted over the previous decade, including the 1941 Revenue Department memo that had connected the original ban directly to opium tax protection. That memo, placed in front of a parliamentary subcommittee in 2020, landed differently than it had when Dr. Naren first found it in the archives. In 1941, it was a fiscal document. In 2020, it was evidence that the foundational legal instrument governing Kratom in Thailand had been built on a rationale that the government itself had never publicly acknowledged. The subcommittee's report, finalized in early 2021, recommended removing Kratom from the Schedule 5 narcotics list entirely, making it legal to grow, possess, consume, and trade, subject to new agricultural and quality regulations. The recommendation passed through the parliamentary process with significant support from Southern Province representatives whose constituencies had been living under the law's weight for 78 years. On August 24, 2021, the amendment to the Narcotics Act took effect. Kratom became legal in Thailand. The trees that had been criminal for 78 years were, as of that morning, agricultural assets. Somchai heard about it from a radio program playing in the plantation office while he was collecting his weekly pay. He sat for a moment after the announcement ended. Then he folded his pay envelope, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked back to the rows. The suspended sentence from 2019 was not reviewed. His criminal record was not expunged. No process existed to address the legal consequences accumulated by the hundreds of thousands of people prosecuted under the 1943 Act and its successors. The law that had made them criminals was gone. The record remained. In the United States, the FDA's position had not changed. Scott Gottlieb had left the commissionership in 2019. His successors maintained the agency's existing stance, Kratom as a substance of concern with no accepted medical use. Several states had passed versions of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, a regulatory framework developed by the American Kratom Association that established age restrictions, labeling requirements, and product testing standards. Utah was first in 2019. Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and Oklahoma followed. These state laws created the first formal regulatory framework for Kratom anywhere in the Western world. They did not resolve the federal question. They created a patchwork, Kratom legal and regulated in some states, banned in others, legal but unregulated in most, that satisfied nobody completely and protected consumers partially. The science, meanwhile, was producing findings that neither the pro-Kratom nor anti-Kratom position had fully anticipated. A 2020 study from the University of Florida, analyzing data from 2,798 Kratom users, found that the majority used it for pain management, mood enhancement, or opioid withdrawal, and that most reported it as effective for those purposes. Dependence was reported by a significant minority. Severe adverse effects were rare among users of Kratom alone. The study was the largest systematic survey of American Kratom users conducted to that point, and its findings were nuanced in a way that served neither the scheduling advocates nor the unregulated market advocates cleanly. That nuance was the most important thing about it, and nuance, in a regulatory environment built for binary decisions, schedule or don't schedule, ban or don't ban, had no natural home. The DEA quietly announced in 2020 that it was continuing to evaluate Kratom's scheduling status. The evaluation was ongoing. No timeline was provided. The 30-day clock that had started in August 2016 had, in effect, never fully stopped. And somewhere in a research facility with a pharmaceutical industry funding stream, the synthetic metragenine derivative covered by US patent 9,790,229 was moving through preclinical trials, quietly, on schedule, toward the FDA approval process that the natural plant had never been able to enter, because the natural plant, owned by no one, could fund no clinical trial, hire no regulatory affairs team, pay no application fee. The gap between what the science showed and what the regulation reflected had never been wider. It had also, in the history of Kratom, never been more consequential, because the number of people living inside that gap was no longer a village in southern Thailand. It was 15 million Americans, and counting. Thailand's legalization generated, within 18 months, exactly what the agricultural economists had predicted. Kratom became a regulated export commodity. Licensed processing facilities opened in Surat Thani, Nakhon Si Thammarat, and Krabi, the same southern provinces where enforcement had been concentrated for decades, where police had collected fines from rubber tappers for possession of leaves that grew on their own land. The government established quality standards, export licensing procedures, and a tax framework. By the end of 2022, Kratom exports were generating measurable foreign exchange revenue. The projections for $1 billion annual industry within 5 years were being cited in agricultural ministry briefings, with the straightforward enthusiasm of officials presenting a growth opportunity. The trees that Somchai's grandfather had planted were now, technically, an agricultural asset with export potential. Somchai himself received nothing. No letter arrived from the provincial court reviewing his 2019 conviction. No government office contacted him about the suspended sentence that still sat on his record. No compensation process existed for the fine that had emptied his household savings, money that had left the family permanently and had not returned simply because the law that justified its extraction had been repealed. His criminal record remained exactly as it was on the day the amendment passed. The only thing that changed was that the act for which he'd been prosecuted was no longer an act. He was not alone in this. Estimates from Thai legal advocacy organizations placed the number of people with active Kratom convictions, possession, distribution, cultivation, at somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000. The Thai government, in its legislative discussions around the 2021 amendment, had not established any mechanism for reviewing those cases. The question of what to do with the human residue of 78 years of enforcement had not been answered because it had not been seriously asked. Somchai planted 3 new Kratom trees along the eastern edge of his property in September 2021, 3 weeks after the amendment took effect. He did it on a Sunday morning, methodically, with the same attention to soil preparation that his uncle had taught him for the rubber trees. Racheni watched from the porch. She'd been watching things from that porch for 24 years. The trees would take several years to mature to full leaf production. He would wait. In the United States, the regulatory situation had reached a state that experts across the political spectrum described, using different language, as unsustainable. The Kratom Consumer Protection Act model, consumer-focused state legislation, establishing age limits, purity testing, and labeling requirements, had spread to 7 states by 2023. The framework was practical, narrow, and deliberately non-committal on the question of Kratom's fundamental nature. It regulated the product without classifying it. It protected the consumer without resolving the science. The FDA's evaluation process had produced by 2023 a request to the National Institute on Drug Abuse to fund dedicated clinical research on Kratom's therapeutic potential and risk profile. The request was the first formal acknowledgement by a federal agency that the existing evidence base was insufficient to make the scheduling determination the DEA had been deferring since 2016. It was also for researchers who had been trying to secure funding for Kratom studies for a decade, a form of vindication that arrived approximately 10 years too late. The research funding problem had a specific structural cause that the funding request did not address. Clinical trials for drug approval require a sponsor, an entity willing to finance years of research, regulatory preparation, and application costs that routinely exceed $1 billion for a new pharmaceutical. Natural plant compounds cannot be patented. A company that spent $1 billion proving Kratom's efficacy in clinical trials would immediately find its investment replicated by any competitor who grew the same plant. The economics made natural Kratom unsponsored by design. The only entities for whom clinical trial investment made sense were those holding patents on synthetic derivatives. US patent 9,790,229 had, by 2023, generated a small family of related patent applications covering additional synthetic mitragynine modifications. The preclinical work was advancing. Nothing had reached human trials yet. The timeline for a synthetic kratom-derived pharmaceutical reaching the market, even under optimistic projections, was a minimum of 7 to 10 years from the earliest human trials. During those 7 to 10 years, 15 million Americans would continue using unregulated natural kratom, purchased from gas stations and online vendors at doses and purities they could not verify. The gap was not narrowing, it was structurally maintained. Dr. Narin's book, published in Thai with an English summary appended, had sold modestly, well for academic work in Thailand, invisibly by any other measure. The English summary had been read by several American and European researchers who cited it in their own papers. His central argument, that kratom prohibition had never been primarily a public health project in any country where it had occurred, was being engaged with seriously in academic literature for the first time. He was 72 years old. He had spent 30 years inside the institution that, as he now documented in careful historical detail, had built its kratom policy on a foundation that had never been what it claimed to be. The documentation was precise. The citations were primary sources. The conclusion was specific. The 1943 Thai Kratom Act was a fiscal instrument. The subsequent enforcement apparatus built on that act had produced criminalization outcomes concentrated in the rural poor, the rubber tappers, the fishermen, the agricultural workers, while leaving the upper economic strata of Thai society, which had less occupational need for kratom, essentially untouched. That class concentration in enforcement outcomes was not unique to Thailand. The American states that had banned kratom contained, within their borders, populations whose opioid dependence had been generated by pharmaceutical companies, managed inadequately by the medical system, and addressed in part through kratom self-medication. Those populations were predominantly rural, predominantly lower income, and predominantly lacking access to addiction medicine specialists. The enforcement of kratom bans fell most heavily on the people with the fewest alternatives. Dr. Narin noted in his book's final chapter that this pattern, prohibition concentrated among populations with no political leverage, while the commercial interests capable of influencing regulation manoeuvred around the same prohibition, was not a coincidence. It was a structural outcome that reproduced itself independently across different countries, different decades, and different regulatory systems, because the economic incentives that generated it were consistent even when the institutions implementing it were completely different. He submitted the manuscript to a second publisher for a revised edition with updated post-legalization data. The science in 2023 and 2024, taken as a whole, supported a picture that was genuinely complex and resistant to either the kratom is safe or kratom is dangerous framing that dominated public discourse. The addiction liability was real, documented and measurable. Withdrawal syndrome, physical dependence after regular use, psychological craving in heavy users. These were not manufactured concerns. People had suffered through kratom withdrawal in ways that required medical support. Treatment centers in the United States were seeing kratom-dependent patients, most of whom had come to kratom from opioids and found themselves dependent on a second substance in the process of getting off the first. The harm profile, however, remained categorically different from classic opioids. Respiratory depression, the mechanism by which opioid overdose kills, was rare in kratom-only cases. The partial agonism ceiling that pharmacologists had been citing since the beginning of the American debate had held, empirically, across 15 years of mass use in the United States. Kratom was not killing people the way fentanyl was killing people. The comparison, which the FDA had repeatedly implied through its language, was not supported by emergency room data, medical examiner reports, or any systematic epidemiological analysis. What Kratom was doing, in the population data, in the user surveys, in the treatment center intake reports, was something more complicated and less legible than either its advocates or its opponents had managed to articulate. It was functioning simultaneously as a harm reduction tool for some users, a maintenance dependency for others, and an escalation risk for a smaller subset who combined it with other substances. These three populations existed within the same legal product category, buying from the same vendors, with no labeling, dosing guidance, or clinical oversight to distinguish their situations from each other. The absence of regulation was producing identical outcomes to prohibition, just at higher volume. Neither approach had found the population that was actually at risk and protected it while leaving the functional users alone. In Malaysia, Kratom remained Schedule 1, possession still technically carrying the death penalty for trafficking quantities, though execution specifically for Kratom had not been documented. Enforcement was inconsistent, concentrated geographically, and producing the same class-skewed outcomes that Dr. Narin had documented in Thailand. The 4 times 100 mixture had never disappeared. It had simply moved further from public view, into spaces where health researchers had less access, and harm reduction workers had no legal standing to operate. The teenagers who had been documented in the 2004 emergency department data were in their 30s now. Some had stopped, some had not. Somchai's 3 new trees, by the end of 2023, had reached 2 meters in height, not yet productive. He checked them every few days, the way a farmer checks anything he has planted and must wait for. The rest of the property's established trees were now technically a licensed agricultural resource. He had registered them under the new framework, a process that required 3 forms, 2 office visits to Surat Thani city, and a registration fee that was modest by urban standards and represented 2 days of plantation wages. He had done it without apparent resentment. Registration was the current requirement. He met it. What he could not register, and what no government form had a field for, was the 32 years of daily use that had preceded the legalization, the neuroadaptation, the 2 cups daily, the left knee that required the midday dose to walk the afternoon rows without stopping. The dependence was real, and it was his, and it had been produced by a plant that was now legal, had once been criminal, and had been both things in the same body across the same lifetime. He was 52 years old. His hands were still steady in the mornings. Ratchaney had been keeping a close eye on the registration papers, making sure they were filed correctly, following the new regulations with the careful attention of someone who had watched what happened when regulations were ignored. She understood something that the government's new agricultural framework had not fully processed. For the people who had lived under the old law, legalization was not a liberation. It was a reclassification. The tree was the same. The morning was the same. Only the paperwork had changed. And in Washington, the DEA's evaluation remained open. No timeline. No determination. The clock that had started in August 2016, paused in October 2016, restarted in 2017, and had been running in some indeterminate state since then, continued running. The question of what Kratom was, legally, federally, definitively, remained unanswered in the country with the largest Kratom-using population outside Southeast Asia. 15 million people. No answer. The evaluation ongoing. What happened to those people in the gap between the science that existed and the regulation that hadn't arrived was not being tracked by any federal agency with the authority to do anything about it. The sun has not cleared the tree line yet in Surat Thani province. Somchai Wiroj is 52 years old, standing on the same porch where Ratchini has watched things for 24 years, holding the same clay cup his uncle left him. The cup is dark on the inside from decades of the same boil, the same 11 minutes, the same leaf. His 3 new trees are visible from where he stands, 2 meters tall now, not yet producing, still becoming what they will eventually be. The established trees behind them are heavy with leaves in the wet season humidity. Registered, licensed, legal. He drinks. Nothing about the morning has changed except the paperwork. That image, the cup, the porch, the trees, the pre-dawn dark, is the same image that opened this story. But the viewer seeing it now is standing in a completely different place than the viewer who saw it at the beginning. The 15 million people doing exactly this, in various forms across Southeast Asia, are no longer an abstraction. They have a name, a clay pot, a left knee that requires the midday dose, a criminal record for something that became an agricultural asset 3 years after the conviction. They have a wife who borrowed money from her sister. They have a tree planted by a grandfather who never once thought of it as anything other than a tree. The plant did not change. Everything around it did. Repeatedly, in opposite directions, simultaneously in different countries. That is the thing about Kratom that no regulatory framework has yet managed to contain. It refuses to be only one thing. In the time it has taken to tell this story, the DEA's evaluation has not concluded. The FDA has not approved a single clinical application for Kratom or any of its natural derivatives. The synthetic mitragynine patent filed in 2015 is still advancing through preclinical development, still moving, still funded, still heading toward an approval process that the natural plant was structurally prevented from entering. The American Kratom Association is still lobbying. State legislatures are still passing contradictory laws. Treatment centers are still admitting Kratom-dependent patients. Veterans are still using it for pain they cannot manage otherwise. People are still getting off opioids with it. People are still getting dependent on it in the process. All of those things are true. At the same time, right now, Dr. Naren Kassetsiri's revised book is at the publisher. He is 72 and has spent more of his professional life studying this plant than most people spend on any single subject. His central finding, after all of it, is not a verdict on Kratom. It is a verdict on the systems that have tried to manage it. Each one, in each country, in each decade, shaped more by economic interest and institutional inertia than by the evidence available at the time. The evidence was frequently available. The decisions frequently went the other direction. He finished the revised manuscript on a Tuesday. He sent it by email. He made tea, not Kratom tea. He has never used it himself. The irony of that detail is the kind that does not announce itself. The 4 times 100 mixture is still being consumed in rural Malaysia and southern Thailand, in the same configurations that Dr. Naren flagged in 1989 and formally documented in 2003. The population using it has cycled. The teenagers of 1996 are middle-aged now, and a new cohort of teenagers has found the same recipe through the same informal channels that have always transmitted it. No targeted intervention program for the mixture specifically has been implemented at scale in any country where it is prevalent. The cough syrup is still on the shelf. That one fact, the cough syrup still on the shelf, contains the entire history of how Kratom has been regulated. The dangerous variable in the most dangerous preparation was never the plant. The plant was banned. The variable was left alone. Somchai finishes his tea. He rinses the clay cup at the outdoor tap, sets it on the same stone ledge where it dries every morning, and walks toward the first row of trees. His gait on the left side carries a slight adjustment. The knee, accommodated rather than hidden, present in every step. The morning is dark and humid and smells of rubber sap and wet soil. He has done this approximately 13,000 times. Now, one final number, and then the story ends. Except the story doesn't end, because this is where it is right now, still in motion, still unresolved. As of 2024, Kratom is legal in most of the United States, banned in 6 states, banned in 15 countries, legal and newly regulated in Thailand, legal and unregulated in Indonesia, banned under penalty of death for trafficking in Malaysia, and under active DEA evaluation in the federal jurisdiction that covers the largest kratom-using population in the Western world. The DEA evaluation has been ongoing for 8 years. There is no projected completion date. Somewhere in a preclinical laboratory, the synthetic version of the compound in Somchai's cup is being prepared for the next stage of trials. If it passes, and if it eventually reaches approval, it will be prescribed by doctors, dispensed by pharmacists, covered by insurance, and sold at a price determined by the patent holder. It will work, in clinical terms, similarly to the leaf in the clay cup. It will be legal everywhere. It will be owned by someone. The leaf will still be growing on the tree. And the question that nobody in 80 years of regulation has managed to answer, whether kratom is a medicine that was criminalized, an addiction that was normalized, or simply something that the existing categories were never built to hold, remains open, exactly where it has always been.